Good evening, everyone. This is the video for U.S. foreign policy from the Vietnam War to the present. And I just want to let everybody know that I do not have the pen, so I'm not going to be able to write on this. I left the pen at school, and I apologize for that. So let's just do a quick review. Some classes get further than others with the Vietnam War, but LBJ in 1964 is going to have the incident that lets us get involved in this conflict. Remember, prior to LBJ's presidency, under Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, military advisors were sent to the region. Vietnam was in its own civil war. The North was communist and the South was not communist. This was after they had broken away from France when Vietnam was part of Indochina. But the issue in 1964 takes place in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was the water outside of Vietnam, off the coast of Vietnam. Two U.S. ships, the Turner Joy and the Maddox, were allegedly attacked by the communists, and this propelled LBJ to go ask Congress for the authority to use troops to defend American interests. It will not be a declaration of war. Two senators, that's it, not anybody else, voted against this decision. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. The only two votes against the use of force in Vietnam were Ernest Gruening and Wayne Morse. And Wayne Morse even said that he felt this would be one of the worst foreign policy decisions the country had ever made. Now, as the war goes on, this is an area, Southeast Asia, that Americans were probably not very familiar with. And there are some who refer to a credibility gap, the media questioning if the government was really telling us everything that we needed to know about this conflict. So as the war goes on, the number of doves, and those are people who are against the war, increases. So as our troop level increases, so do the protests. Hawks were in favor of the war. And then the turning point year is 1968. This year begins with a surprise attack by the North Vietnamese on the Vietnamese New Year Tet celebration. 30 different locations were attacked, and even though it wasn't a devastating military defeat for the Americans, it was televised. And for people to see this at home definitely had a negative influence on the country's ability or desire to support the war effort. So protests will continue to mount after this. Now, the war was taking such a toll on LBJ that he also announced he was not going to run for re-election. So that opened up the Democratic ticket, the front runner being Robert Kennedy. But in April of 1968, first we have to deal with the terrible assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And then June, just 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was also assassinated. So the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968 became one of the most well-known in American history. You have two candidates, Eugene McCarthy, who was the anti-war candidate, and Hubert H. Humphrey, who was the vice president for LBJ, both looking for the nomination. But then you also have the city with a group of yippies that have descended into Chicago, thousands of young hippies with their nominee, Pegasus. And the mayor of the city has his hands full. Richard Daley has taxi cab drivers on strike, telephone operators on strike, bus drivers on strike, and he also has every news media outlet in Chicago. So as the fighting takes place inside the convention hall, outside, the yippies simply want to stay in the park beyond 11 o'clock. But Daley will not allow them to do so, and he will order the cops at 11 o'clock to forcibly remove them. And this entire incident was also broadcast on the news as the yippies were chanting, "The whole world is watching." The beneficiary of all of this will be Richard Nixon, and it is Richard Nixon who will win the 1968 presidential election and announces that his policy in Vietnam will be to train the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. So gradually he was hoping to remove troops with his Nixon doctrine and Vietnamization policy. However, while he was doing that in public, secretly the Nixon military decision to bomb Cambodia came back to haunt him. So because we expanded the war into Cambodia, when students found out about this, or when the public found out, students at Kent State University decided to protest. That protest was met with a group from with the National Guard troops, and 4 students were shot dead, as you can see from this iconic photo, although I'm pointing with my finger and I don't think that's going to come through on the video. But the Nixon presidency is also going to have some constitutional issues and debates as well. There was a secret government document, maybe about 7,000 pages, called the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers were evidence of the U.S. policy in Vietnam all the way back to President Truman. So it really chronicles the decisions made by the Truman administration, by the Eisenhower administration, by the Kennedy administration, and I'm sure mostly by the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. But Nixon did not want these documents released, and a man, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked them to the New York Times. This case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times, arguing that they did have a right, First Amendment, freedom of the press, to print this information. Later in the year, I'll tell you about the Watergate scandal under Nixon. I'll also tell you how Nixon had some of his people break into the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg as a bit of a form of harassment. Now, also under Nixon, we're going to move away from Vietnam for a second, and his philosophy towards China, détente, both of those things, his policy towards China and his détente policy with the Soviet Union are of tremendous importance. Détente is a relaxation of Cold War tensions. He's trying to make relations with the Soviet Union better. He's also the first president to visit communist China. He did so in 1972. And the reason why it's called ping pong diplomacy, the Chinese ping pong team actually invited our ping pong team as a sign of goodwill, although I think we got beat very badly. And those of you that know Forrest Gump, that was what they were trying to symbolize, as he was such a good ping pong player. Now, toward the end of Nixon's presidency, Congress decides that maybe we've given the president too much power with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, so that the Congress decides to pass the War Powers Act. And what this will do is it will restrict the president to 60 days to have the authority to use troops in another country. He must notify Congress within those 60 days. If they do not support his decision, then he has 30 days to remove the troops out of whatever country he's in. So the War Powers Act is a severe limitation on the president as commander-in-chief to use force without the authority of Congress. Nixon is going to resign due to the Watergate scandal, which you'll learn later on. I just realized I forgot to mention this. The release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, many people compared it to what Edward Snowden did with his WikiLeaks. If you've been following the last couple of years, there is a documentary that's going to be on HBO in a week about the whole Edward Snowden situation. Gerald Ford, I don't have much for foreign policy. He was only in office for about 2 years, and unfortunately, during his presidency, Saigon fell to the communists. So in 1975, Vietnam was under total communist rule. Ford is going to lose the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter, and this presidency has many significant foreign policy events. First, you should know that Jimmy Carter was well known for his concern for human rights. He made that a defining characteristic of his presidency, looking out for the well-being of people all over the world. One of the countries that had major problems during this time was South Africa because of its apartheid policy that you probably learned about in 10th grade. And Jimmy Carter had a strong policy toward that government and any other government that would not protect human rights. Panama Canal, we learned that this was started to be built when Teddy Roosevelt was president, but it didn't finish until 1914. And this was our canal that was in another country, and Jimmy Carter felt strongly that the canal should be handed back over to the Panamanians. So he signed a treaty that would do so, but not until the year 2000. There are those who criticize Jimmy Carter for believing that he was just giving something over without getting anything in return. Camp David Accords, that is a peace treaty that Carter helped negotiate between Egypt and Israel, which was a very big deal at the time. The Israeli leader was Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and the Egyptian leader was President Anwar al-Sadat. This was negotiated in Maryland at Camp David and symbolized what people hoped would have been progress with all the conflicts in the Middle East. You probably learned about the Arab-Israeli conflict last year. Unfortunately, 1 year after this was signed, Anwar al-Sadat was killed by his own people in Egypt, and we all know how the story goes from that point on. Now, the last thing under Carter is very complicated. It is the Iranian hostage crisis. So what happened here is that there was a leader of Iran, the Shah of Iran, who in the 1970s, late 70s, was encouraging modernization and westernization in his country. So this was a leader who was more supportive of the U.S. efforts in the region and within Iran as well. But 1979, radical fundamentalists overthrew him and put the Ayatollah Khomeini into power. The Shah actually was suffering from cancer and came to America to get treatment in our hospitals. But after this Islamic revolution in Iran, the Iranian Revolution, there is an incident where Iranians stormed our embassy and held 55 Americans hostage. And this was a major story, one that I remember even as an 8-year-old, because the newspapers kept counting the days on the top, day 287, day 288. So Carter did give approval for a rescue mission in which helicopters were supposed to go in. But unfortunately, the helicopters crashed and the mission was a disaster, which many people think was symbolic of Carter's presidency anyway. So when were these hostages finally released? They were released after 444 days. They were released on a very important day, January 20th, 1981, the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated president. It's also the day that Miss Canone was born. So a little shout out for Miss Canone today. Now, the decision to release hostages on that day has come under some scrutiny. There is one person that wrote a book claiming that people in the Reagan camp asked the Iranians or made a deal to delay the release of the hostages until after the election, but that is not something that has ever been proven. And one last event for Jimmy Carter's presidency, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 is of interesting importance because we supported the Afghanis. And in response to it, we stopped trading certain goods with the Soviets, but we tried to prevent certain goods from getting into the Soviet Union, but we also boycotted the Moscow Summer Olympics. And that set in motion another 4 years later of the Soviets boycotting our Olympics in Los Angeles. So there is Carter's, what I consider, very tumultuous presidency. And then we will go to 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. This is where I was hoping to have the pen. So Ronald Reagan as president is going to ramp up our military spending. He's going to help support a initiative called Star Wars, which is a defense mechanism against any nuclear attacks. But we're also going to build up our nuclear weaponry and hope that it will spend the Russians into submission. Now, there's also some issues with Reagan. He went into an island, Grenada, in the Caribbean to try to prevent communism from spreading there. But the real big issue is the Iran-Contra affair. This one is where I really needed my pen. So let's try to focus as much as we can here. Reagan is committed to fighting against communism. And in Nicaragua, Nicaragua, which is in Central America, there is a civil war going on between the Contras and the Sandinistas. And Reagan, the Sandinistas were communist. So Reagan and his administration wanted to support the Contras. they went to Congress and asked for the authority to provide financial support to the Contras. And with the Boland Amendment, Congress said no. Congress rejected this request. Now, while that's going on, there are other hostages. Please don't compare these two. They're not the same hostages as the ones I just told you about. And by the way, the ones I told you about under Carter, for those of you that know the movie Argo, that story is about those hostages in 1979 and 1980. This is a whole new set of hostages in the mid-80s that were being held in Lebanon. And there was a secret deal that took place during this time. So here's the deal. Somebody, and you see this picture Oliver North right here because he's clearly one of the figures that was involved in this. But in the Reagan administration, they made a deal with Iran because Iran was fighting a war with Iraq. At this point, I've probably lost some of you, so just do your best here. And the deal with Iran was that we will sell you weapons. So we sold weapons to Iran, who needed them to fight Iraq. But what would Iran give us in return? In return, Iran would get the hostages released. So they would talk to whoever it was in Lebanon who was holding the hostages and make sure that our hostages were released. Now that happened. That all took place. We didn't know why the hostages were released, but everybody was ecstatic and patriotism was running high when the hostages came home. But I told you this plan included the sale of weapons. Well, the sale means we're getting money back. And where did that money then go? The money went to the Contras in Nicaragua, and we funneled it there secretly and went over what Congress said originally. So I'm going to repeat that because this is something that I'll start class with on Monday. But again, we sold weapons to Iran, and in return, they got the release of a group of hostages. They used their weapons against Iraq because that's who they were fighting. And then we took that money and sent it to the Contras in Nicaragua. If you think that the release of hostages at any cost and the desire to fight communism at any cost is a good thing, then you will love the Iran-Contra affair. If you are upset that they went over the Constitution and did this secretly, then you find criticism with the Iran-Contra affair. And then, of course, the big question is, how much did Ronald Reagan know? He claims to have not known anything about the issue. Most of the questions that were given to him, they did hold hearings. And I'm giving you an abbreviated version of a very lengthy story that was on TV day after day. But Oliver North is the one name, if you can remember that, would be good. And I'm also going to play for you maybe a short video from the show American Dad, which a kid once showed me about Oliver North. Okay. And lastly, the improved relation with the Soviet Union that I'm referring to. You probably remember from last year Mikhail Gorbachev. He is the Soviet premier who was going to issue policies like Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was trying to end political suppression in his country, and Perestroika is trying to introduce some elements of free market economics. Some people think Reagan is responsible for ending the Cold War. Other people think that it was just a combination of various factors. But when the actual Cold War ends, George Bush will be president. In 1989, the Berlin Wall will collapse. And then in 91, the Soviet Union collapses. As far as his foreign policy, our issue with Iraq was the first Persian Gulf War when Bush was president. We were trying to protect Kuwait, which was under invasion, from Iraq. Other people who are more cynical think we were interested in oil. But the Persian Gulf War was a very quick victory for the United States. And I will go through this in more detail later on. Then we go to Bill Clinton's presidency. When Bill Clinton was president, that is when the European Union formed. We had some issues, some major issues in Somalia. Any of you that know the movie Black Hawk Down would be familiar with that story. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me at the time. I was young. I didn't really understand why we would be helping people. I don't understand why the fact that we were helping people who were starving would lead to us being attacked. But now, as I'm older and smarter, I realize that the Somalia issue really was far more complicated than I originally thought. And I did once hear Bill Clinton speak at Hofstra. It was a 3-day symposium on his presidency, and they asked him what his biggest regret was as president, without answering anything about Monica Lewinsky, of course, because that was off limits. And he said his failure to address the genocide in Rwanda between the Hutus and Tutsis. Tried to keep it under 20 minutes, but I failed. 20 minutes and 38 seconds and counting. I hope you guys were all able to follow along, and I'm really looking forward to starting review on Monday and get everybody prepared for the first installment of the new and improved AP United States History course. So I'm going to go watch some more basketball now, and everybody have a good rest of your evening, and I will see you Monday morning.